Hello and welcome to Pleasure Reading. I'm your host, Amelia Ruby, and this is a podcast about the pleasure of reading, where I share curated reading lists, author rankings, chats with my bookish friends, and more. If you too take pleasure in reading, I hope that you will subscribe and share this show with a friend. Cheers to your next best book. Hello and welcome to Pleasure Reading, a podcast about the many joys and pleasures of reading, hosted by me, Amelia Ruby. On this show, I share curated reading lists on all sorts of themes, from just released contemporary romance to helpful guides for frugal gardeners to today's very niche theme, underwater horror, thriller, and sci-fi recommendations. Today's episode feels a little more niche than usual, but let me tell you how we got there and why I think you'll want to listen along, whether or not this topic is for you. In the dark depths of winter this year, I wanted to read something that felt spooky, something that felt a little claustrophobic, maybe a little overwhelming under pressure, and that led me to read From Below by Darcy Coates. I had really liked a couple of Darcy Coates' haunted house books that I read last year, and so I wanted to explore more from her, and this book came highly recommended from a What Darcy Coates to Read First YouTube video. So I decided to read From Below. Now, this is a book that's set underwater. I'll tell you more about it when we get to the recommendation part, but I enjoyed it so much that after finishing it, I wanted to read more books like it. And I wanted to watch some movies that were set underwater. And I thought, maybe I'll listen to some podcasts that are also about dives and shipwrecks and things like this. And so reading that book sent me down this entire rabbit hole trying to find more underwater books, movies, and podcasts. I wanted to reclaim the feeling of being immersed in that book so much that it dictated basically like my next 5 reads and all of the movies that I've watched over the past few months. What I think is going to be fun about this episode is I'm going to take you down the rabbit hole with me. I'm going to tell you, how did I encounter these other books and these movies? What came up and came through? And honestly, I'm still traveling down this rabbit hole. I have not finished my whole movie list of underwater films to watch, but I wanted to pause here so that you could come on the journey with me, because at this point, I've been on it for 3 months, and I think I'm going to keep going. So with all of that shared, let's dive in, pun intended, to this list of 13 or more underwater horror, thriller, and sci-fi recommendations, which includes books, movies, TV shows, and fiction podcasts. Let's dive in. I've already told you the first book on this list, but I'm so excited to talk more about it now, and that is From Below by Darcy Coates. This is the book that sent me down the underwater rabbit hole on a, cave dive, if you will. Not apologizing if this episode is full of puns. It's going to happen to us people. But let me give you a quick synopsis of From Below. So this book, at its heart, is about a ship, the SS Arcadia. And we follow that ship on 2 timelines. There is the timeline in 1928, I believe, where the SS Arcadia is a beautiful passenger ship. There are so many people on board enjoying it. And unfortunately, something is starting to go wrong. We don't know why, we don't know how, but things are getting spooky on the ship. Then there's a timeline 50 or 60 years later where a dive crew led by our main character, Cove, and her team are trying to get to the shipwreck. So we know from early in the book that the SS Arcadia disappeared during a routine voyage. It is presumed sunk. And now, in the present day, the wreck has been found. And so we're going back and forth between the dive and the dive team visiting the ship, and then what was happening on the ship in a few days before it sank. And it's definitely creepy, definitely spooky, definitely some supernatural stuff going on, at least we think so. And I think that the strengths of this book come from the dual timeline. In the past, we have this really nice countdown it tells you like this many days before the ship sank and this many days. And so we like count down with it and we're like building that tension and dread. And then in the present, we're sort of counting the dives with the divers. So like in the past, we're going from like 2 days before it sinks, 1 day before it sinks, day it sinks. And in the present, we're going like day of the first dive, day of the second dive. And I think that that structure is just so effective in this book. And I think one of the strengths of this book is how well it handles the experience of being underwater. Because at this point, I have read a lot of underwater books and watched a lot of underwater movies, and many of them really don't mention the water or deal with the water. They treat water like it's like air. We're just doing normal on-land stuff, swimming. But I think that this book really paints the picture of the like claustrophobia of being in a shipwreck. I remember it talks a lot about how like you have to be so careful how you move because there's so much silt on the ship. And if you kick it up, you'll go blind like in a silt storm because the water will get so cloudy. Things like that I never think of and don't see mentioned in many other underwater or shipwreck books just felt so present and made the book like I didn't feel like I was underwater, but I felt the tension of that. And I really felt how high the stakes were. And for me, that made this such just like a memorable, atmospheric horror book. So if you're a horror reader and you only look for one thing on this list, I'm definitely going to recommend From Below by Darcy Coates. And this was available from my library through Hoopla. So, it was like a 1 day sit on the couch, read on my Kindle read for me, and I loved it. Highly, highly, highly recommend From Below by Darcy Coates. After reading From Below and loving it and wanting more underwater horror, I decided to read another underwater horror book that I had heard of but not gotten my hands on yet. And that was A House at the Bottom of a Lake by Josh Malerman. I had heard of this book many, many times. It's pretty short. I'm like, is it even novella length maybe? But I hadn't read it because it doesn't have great reviews. And I had read another book by Josh Malerman and really didn't like it. So it had landed at the low end of my TBR in the past, but it got pulled right to the top when I wanted to read more underwater horror. So let me tell you a bit about the premise before I give you my lightweight review. A House at the Bottom of the Lake is about these two teenagers, James and Amelia, and they meet at the very beginning of the story and agree to go on a first date. And they want to go on a date that's not like all other first dates. And so they decide to go canoeing in this lake. And when they get to the lake, there's like I think more like popular touristy area, but they try to follow the lake through to some less popular parts. And they end up going through this like weird drainage tunnel or something that leads them to this like totally deserted lake that they seem to be the only people who have found it. And as they're there, they realize that there's a house at the bottom of that lake and they feel drawn to it. And they have to decide if they are going to go to the house. Like, are they going to swim down there? Are they going to go in? And, it's a horror novel. It's like, of course they're going to. We know that. I won't spoil what happens once they start swimming there, but I thought the premise of this was so fun. And it's very similar actually to the premise of a movie that I'll mention in a bit because I decided to read it right after I had rewatched that movie. So I think the premise of this is so strong. And I feel like the execution didn't quite do it for me. I loved the supernatural parts that were described, but there was some awkwardness like in the relationship itself. And there were some very oddly written sexual scenes that I just like could not get on board with. I left this book being like, I feel like Josh Malerman just likes to watch the like sex scenes in slashers instead of like any other part of the movie. And, there's nothing wrong with that. To each their own, but it just sort of left me with a weird vibe when I finished reading this book. And the weird vibes weren't from the horror parts of it, which I did enjoy. They were from Josh Malerman attempting to write a teenage relationship. So if you feel okay about that, or if you really love the premise of finding a house at the bottom of a lake, then I think this is definitely worth the read. And if you're not so into that, then maybe it's not the book for you. Who knows? My lukewarm feelings for A House at the Bottom of the Lake did not keep me from reading more underwater books. So up next, I read Pressure by Brian Keene. This seems to only have an ebook release in the US, but I was able to get it again from my library through Hoopla. And I'm so glad I did because it's a different sort of book than the other two. From Below and A House at the Bottom of a Lake are supernatural, spooky, scary horror. Pressure is more sci-fi thriller. And so in this book, we meet world champion free diver and marine biologist Carrie Anderson. And we meet her as she is coming up from a dive where her partner has not surfaced with her. And so we meet her in the middle of this horrible event and health crisis because something has happened underwater and nobody knows what it is yet. And we get to know Carrie as we learn more about where she's been diving, which is off the coast of Mauritius, where the ocean floor is suddenly collapsing at a very alarming rate and nobody knows why. So Carrie had been sent there working with these companies and governmental agencies to free dive and try to figure out what's going on down there. And then her dive partner didn't come up with her. And so now she's finding a new dive partner to go back out and continue investigating. I loved the free diving in this book, and I loved how they were exploring the ocean. And let me tell you, it then went totally off the rails. Way beyond just the underwater portion. There's so much more that goes on. There's some international espionage, if that's your thing. And I thought that it was just a generally enjoyable read. I liked how high the stakes were. I liked how fast it moved. It was a very fun thriller and one that I haven't really seen anybody else talk about. So highly recommend Pressure by Brian Keene if you want to read an underwater book, but one that's not so supernatural spooky and more what's going to happen thrilling. After reading Pressure, I was really intrigued to know, are there other books about being underwater and the ocean that take us down this sort of more sci-fi path? And so I picked up The Swarm by Frank Schatzing. This is a book that was originally published in German. And I got it from the library. And when I got it, I was like, oh, this book is 900 pages long. And I don't know if I'm going to make it through that long of a read. So I did start it. I thought the prose was great. I thought it was really interesting. And then I watched the TV show instead because The Swarm was adapted for TV by the CW a few years ago. So I think the book came out back in 2007 maybe, but the TV show just came out in 2023. So I watched the TV show. I did not finish reading the book. I'm sorry to all of the purists out there, but I'm still putting the book on my list because I loved the television show. So let me give you the kind of overall synopsis, and you can decide if the book or the TV show is for you. So at the opening of this book, there are a series of just strange climate and marine animal phenomena that start happening. Whales begin sinking ships, crabs poison water supplies, and marine life is just wreaking havoc on humans. So we have this sort of premise of the oceans fighting back. And those stories are told through these very personal relationship narratives around here's the scientist who's been studying the crabs. But it's not just the scientist doing science, but also here's her relationship with her kids and her ex-husband and what's going on and how this impacts her life. And I think that's what makes this book so compelling, also probably why it's so long, because it does have this sense of scientific realism, but also the personal drama that to me took it from just being a tense thriller to expanding the stakes into what might really happen to humans if we continue to take the ocean for granted. So I loved the story of this, and maybe when I have more of an attention span one day, I will return to the book. But I would definitely recommend watching the show and then reading the book if you like. It's The Swarm by Frank Schatzing. After that, I took a bit of a break on my underwater reading or watching to make my romance episodes for you. I took a Valentine's break to read some romance, record some episodes here on that. And then I picked up 2 more underwater books. So my next read was The Ocean Above Me by Kevin Seitz. I actually found this book at my local Dollar Tree. I like to go there and look at the books they have, and I get some for my free little library sometimes. And I saw this and I was like, wait, is this an underwater book? Because on the cover, we have a man underwater as the cover of the book. And I was like, yay, it's on theme. So I bought it without reading the synopsis. I was like, great, this is part of my rabbit hole that I'm going down. The book has appeared from the book gods. I must read it now. So I just recently finished The Ocean Above Me by Kevin Seitz. This book has a very cool premise, which is that our main character, Lucas Landon, is a journalist and former war correspondent. And he is doing a series of feature articles on a shrimp boat off the coast of South Carolina. And he is on the boat for at least a week or for their sort of last fishing trip of the season to report on the realities of shrimping in the Southeast. And at the very beginning of the book, the boat is overturned by a huge storm, like these giant waves. The boat gets flipped over. Lucas was in the bathroom when it happened, and the bathroom creates this like air bubble for him as the ship sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And so he has this air bubble and he's like, okay, I'm literally alive in a ship at the bottom of the ocean and I have some air and I have to figure out how to survive. And can I survive? Will people find me? Can I be saved? Should I swim away? Should I try to get to the surface? Like, what do I do? And so the book follows that experience and also has a sort of multimedia format in the process because it includes news articles that he had written on the boat that have now been published. It includes transcripts from his interviews that he'd been recording on the boat, as well as narration as he remembers things from the past of his life and talks about his present situation. I think that overall, this was an enjoyable thriller to read. It was a little unclear to me sometimes who was narrating different parts as we move through the ship. But I think the real strength of this book are one, in the premise where the stakes could not be higher. And then two, it's written by a journalist. So Kevin Seitz is not just a thriller writer. He is an international award-winning journalist. And so he brings in a lot of really important political themes. He talks about who are the people who work on this boat. One of them was a Haitian refugee, and we hear about that person's experience. He also talks a lot about the war in Iraq because Lucas Landon, the main character, had been there reporting, and also the captain of the boat is a veteran of that war. And so I really liked how the author sort of wove in these very high stakes political events with the high stakes of Lucas being trapped in the bathroom at the bottom of the ocean, right? So there's a lot to like here, and I thought it was a really interesting book. And if you're up for all of that, I would definitely recommend The Ocean Above Me by Kevin Seitz. After I had read all of those books, my supernatural ones, my sci-fi ones, my more potentially realistic thriller like that last one, after I read all of that, my spouse JJ looked over at me and said a question that haunts me to this day. What about mermaids? Because if we're going to talk about underwater horror thrillers and sci-fi, mermaids are part of the conversation, right? When we think of underwater creatures, we typically have giant sharks, whales, octopi, the marine animals we know of and their spooky scariness. Or we have mermaids. They are the other underwater entities that people write about in these particular genres, right? So I decided to go in search of a mermaid book to see if I was really interested in mermaids. And I read Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant. So this is actually a novella. It's a prequel to her book Into the Drowning Deep. And I really loved this prequel, probably because it has a lot of similar plot lines to the other things I liked about underwater books. So Rolling in the Deep actually felt the most similar to me to From Below, but with mermaids. So let me just read you the really quick synopsis so you can get a sense what this one's about. When the Imagine Network commissioned a documentary on mermaids to be filmed from a cruise ship, they expected what they had always received before: an assortment of eyewitness reports that proved nothing, some footage that proved even less, and the kind of ratings that only came from peddling imaginary creatures to the masses. They didn't expect actual mermaids. They certainly didn't expect those mermaids to have teeth. This is the story of a ship lost at sea with all hands. Some have called it a hoax, others have called it a maritime tragedy. Whatever the truth may be, it will only be found below the bathypelagic zone in the Mariana Trench. And the depths are very good at keeping secrets. Dun dun dun. So in this book, we start out with like a press clipping that talks about how the ship was discovered with no crew on board, not a single person present, just like floating in the ocean. And then we get to learn through flashbacks what happened on board the ship. It was really interesting to read. It's also a super short and great audiobook. Highly recommend Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant. And I will be reading Into the Drowning Deep as well. And reading this, I feel like I don't think I have a new interest in mermaids, is what I learned. Like the pieces I liked about it were about being on the ship, they were about people diving, but I wasn't that interested in the mermaids themselves, right? They certainly didn't expect those mermaids to have teeth. And that was cool, but I don't think is a new interest for me. So my answer to what about mermaids is that that's not quite my underwater horror, thriller, or sci-fi interest, but I do highly recommend this book, Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant. Now, before I move on from the books, I also just want to say that there are two more books on my underwater TBR that I wanted to mention here, and they are both entitled The Deep, which is really just like common, I think, in this underwater genre. So the first is The Deep by Nick Cutter. Nick Cutter is a very popular horror author, and this book sort of combines global diseases and pandemics with the horror of the ocean. So essentially, in this book at the start, you learn that there's this disease called the Gets that is just like ruining humanity because people start to forget everything. And there's no cure for the disease, except people seem to have found one deep in the ocean. And so this is a bit more of like biotech thriller, spooky, scary horror. And I think it could really be for me. So I'm really looking forward to reading The Deep by Nick Cutter. And then the other book called The Deep that I want to read is The Deep by Alma Katsu, also a well-known horror writer. And in her book, The Deep, we get to go on a Titanic journey. So we follow two people who were on the Titanic, a maid named Annie and a guest named Mark, who survive the Titanic disaster. And then they meet again later and realize that their oceanic horrors are not over. I don't know any more than that because the synopsis is chillingly vague, but I am really excited to read that one as well. So just to quickly recap the books in this episode, my underwater rabbit hole began with From Below by Darcy Coates, a book about divers exploring a shipwreck that counts down what happened on the last days of the ship as it builds tension with what's going on with the divers underwater. Then I read A House at the Bottom of a Lake by Josh Mallerman, which is teenagers finding a secret lake with a house at the bottom of it and what unfolds. After that, I found my way to Pressure by Brian Keene, which takes us into the sort of eco-thriller biotech horror zone as the ocean is collapsing underneath an island, and free divers are trying to figure out why under increasingly dangerous circumstances. Then I read The Swarm by Frank Schatzing, or rather, I should say I started reading it and then watched the TV show, which takes us on a global journey of the ocean fighting back against its destruction by human beings and the really personal and widespread impacts of that. From there, The Ocean Above Me by Kevin Seitz is a book that found me at the dollar store. And that features a journalist who is reporting on a shrimping vessel when it capsizes in a big storm. It gets trapped at the bottom of the boat at the bottom of the ocean. And finally, I read Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant to consider if I like mermaids. And I don't think that's my favorite trope, theme, characterization of underwater horror, but Rolling in the Deep is a great novella about a ship that has been found without any passengers and what happened in the final days of its voyage when everyone disappeared. So those are the underwater horror, sci-fi, and thriller books that I've read, as well as two books called The Deep that are up next on my TBR, The Deep by Nick Cutter and The Deep by Alma Katsu. that is the bookish portion of this episode. And very briefly, I also wanted to recommend some movies and fiction podcasts that I've enjoyed on these themes. This is probably the first time that a pleasure reading episode is also including other media formats. But for me, it just like all came together. This has truly been the theme of my entire winter leading into spring. So let me tell you about a few movies that I've really enjoyed as well. So when I read A House at the Bottom of a Lake by Josh Malerman, then I had to rewatch The Deep House, which is also a movie about a house at the bottom of a lake. And it's shot in this really fun sort of found footage way because we have these two main characters. They're a couple and they have a YouTube channel that they're trying to like get going and make popular so they can make money from it. And so they're going on this trip to do some diving. And when they get to the lake that they're going to, there's like a ton of people there. It's like a tourist trap. And so they start talking to this guy who's there and he's like, well, I can take you to a secret lake that was flooded when they made a dam. So there are houses at the bottom of it. And like, that'd be so cool for your YouTube channel. And so they let him take them there and, spooky, scary things unfold in the water. So I really liked The Deep House and would highly recommend it if you're interested in underwater horror. I also really like 47 Meters Down and the sequel, 47 Meters Down Uncaged. In 47 Meters Down, we have Mandy Moore and another actress who is not as famous as Mandy Moore. And they are sisters, and they're on this fun tropical trip. And her sister is like, we just need to be more adventurous. So they meet these guys at the club one night. And then those guys are like, do you want to go shark diving? And Mandy Moore is like, no. And the sister is like, yes. And so they go and they get all their gear on and they get in the cage and they go under the water and the sharks arrive. And then the chain holding the cage breaks and they are dropped to the bottom of the ocean. And we have to see what happens from there. So that's the premise in the beginning of 47 Meters Down. In 47 Meters Down Uncaged, we have a father and two daughters. And the father is like an underwater cave diving mapper. Like he makes maps of underwater caves so that researchers can go into them and explore them. And I think he does research there as well. And his daughters end up trapped in that cave through a series of mishaps. And they have to try to get out of this underwater cave. While also there are creatures there, constant passageways caving in. They have to find their way out. So I think both of those were actually super well done and would recommend the 47 Meters Down movies. If you want something more supernatural, I would recommend The Cave, which came out in 2005 and stars one of my faves, Morris Chestnut. And in this movie, we actually open in the Cold War where we have these sort of plunderers trying to excavate this old church because they think that there is treasure there somehow. And they end up falling through the floor into this cave system. And then there's a rock slide on top of them. And we sort of were like, oh, these people are trapped in there. What's happening? And then we move from the Cold War into the present. And there's this research team that has been excavating this site and realizes that there's a cave below and they need divers to explore what's there. And so Morris Chestnut is one of those divers. They come in, they get trapped there, and there are some spooky, scary monsters down in that cave system that you will have to watch the movie to learn about. And then my final film recommendation here is The Sanctum, which came out in 2011. It is a 3D action thriller film produced by James Cameron. So definitely has a big, flashy, splashy effects in it. But essentially in this film, we have this giant hole in the middle of the jungle. And there's all these caves down there. And many of the caves are underwater. And this team has gone down to explore them and map them. And a tropical storm comes and moves in faster than they expected. And so some of the cave divers are trapped down there and they have to try to find their way out without enough resources. And so this was inspired by a true story, apparently. And it's a really, I think, impressively done film. And I say that because I've now watched a lot of other cave movies in the process of enjoying this genre, and Sanctum was my favorite. Some other films that I have watched on this journey were Deep Blue Sea, The Abyss, Below, The Rift, The Reef, Open Water, The Shallows, The Meg, and more. So there are like a lot of underwater movies. This was also seemingly a very, very popular theme in the late 80s, early 90s. So we have these sort of waves. There's like the late 80s, early 90s ones. There's like the early 2000s ones. There's some more contemporary ones. I have put a list of movies that I've watched like this in the show notes from my Letterboxd. And if you want more underwater movies, you can find that there. But the ones I do recommend are 47 Meters Down and its sequel, Uncaged, The Deep House, Sanctum, and The Cave. And then finally, if you haven't had enough underwater thrillers yet, I do have 2 podcasts to recommend to you. So my spouse, JJ, loves fiction podcasts and audio dramas and recommended one called Cascadia to me. I'll read you the synopsis quickly. So here's what it says. 10 years after a cataclysmic earthquake and tsunami devastates the Pacific Northwest, a new ocean floor reveals itself along the infamous Cascadia subduction zone. But when philanthropic billionaire Wesley Badger falls unfit to go on a deep-sea expedition to explore the new area, rookie Captain Declan Walters must step up and pilot the Alexandria submarine through the uncharted Pacific abyss. And the podcast unfolds from there. It was really well done, and I really liked being underwater with them, so definitely recommend Cascadia. And then I was also reminded that the first ever fiction podcast I listened to was also set underwater and on a ship. So it was called Last Known Position. It's made by Q-Code, and it follows this group of underwater experts, including a submarine pilot, Michaela Soto, who is played by Gina Rodriguez. And they are trying to recover a plane that vanished over the Pacific Ocean. So there's this giant ship that goes off on this expedition funded by the billionaire whose family was on the flight. And they soon realize that there's more going on there, especially when they are getting into the water. So also really enjoyed that one. And if you want underwater podcasts, I do recommend Last Known Position and Cascadia. Okay, friends, you have now gone down the rabbit hole with me. We have sunk to the bottom of this ocean. And I hope you enjoyed these underwater horror, thriller, and sci-fi wrecks. As you heard me talk about throughout, this all started from loving one book. Then I remembered another book on my TBR that might be similar. Then I started searching for things through my library, found a bunch of them on Hoopla. Then I went and looked at some movies, remembered things I'd seen before, looked up new ones. Then I found a random book at the dollar store that sucked me back in. And my spouse recommended some podcasts that kept me going. So that is how I found my way down this rabbit hole and how this episode finds its way to you. I also think it's a great example of how, like, when I was thinking underwater horror, thriller, sci-fi, I'm like, it'll all be pretty similar. But there are so many micro genres underneath that, right? We have like underwater horror and thriller that's supernatural, underwater horror and thriller that's about monsters based on marine animals, underwater horror and thriller that's about alien monsters. We have underwater horror and thriller that is realistic or about real life events, people being trapped in caves or with air bubbles in boats. We have underwater horror that is set in one location versus that is set all over the world's oceans. We have underwater horror that is specifically about sharks. We have underwater horror that is specifically about mermaids, right? There's so many different micro genres under this like one umbrella of creepy underwater things that I was interested in. And it's been fun to map it out. That's why I make this podcast. And one thing I really enjoy about reading and watching movies and listening to podcasts is the way that a story with the same opening premise, a ship has sunk, or a ship has been discovered with no people on it, can go so many different directions. And that's been really fun to explore in this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, you can find all of the books linked below in the show notes. If you make a purchase from my bookshop link, I will receive a small affiliate payment that I take as a thank you for the book rec. This time, I have also linked the list of movies I recommend with underwater themes, as well as the 2 podcasts, Cascadia by 911 Podcasts and Last Known Position by Q-Code. Up next, I plan to keep reading some underwater books, but I don't think I'll make any more episodes about it. So we shall see where my spring and summer reading take me. For now, I'll just say cheers to your next best book.